What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to the Mining Pod. For this week's show, we welcome Haley Thomson, the Director of Energy Trading at Luxor Technologies. Haley has built a career on energy trading and worked in the ERCOT region, specifically in Texas. So we spend this pod talking about ERCOT and specifically how ERCOT is going to manage all of the AI and HPC demand that is currently trying to break into its power market. So without further ado, please enjoy the show.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com.
Today's show is brought to you by Digital Shovel. Digital Shovel is a leading manufacturer of modular mining pods as well as PDUs and switchgears. Unlike many other competitors, their product is designed and manufactured in North America with a complete UL inspection on the entire unit, not just individual components. Additionally, Digital Shovel is one of the most vertically integrated manufacturers of over 75,000 square feet of sheet metal shop, SMT and wave solder PCB assembly, as well as final assembly all under one roof in Toronto, Canada. Their price point leads the industry when compared to products with rates as low as $69,000 per megawatt for a complete data center with smart PDUs and switchgears. To learn more, visit digitalshovel.com. All right, Mr. Thomson, welcome back to the Mining Pod. How you doing, man?
Good. Hey, Colin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. We really enjoyed your brief segment in last week's news roundup, or a few weeks ago. We're recording this a week after, but this will be released in early March. And so we wanted to have you back on to talk specifically about ERCOT a little bit more and how Texas is going to weather the slew of demand that is currently knocking on their door for hyperscalers, AI, HPC, and Bitcoin mining. So to just set the stage, I think it would be helpful for listeners. Some of them probably know this well, some might not. What makes ERCOT such a special power market and why it has become such a hub for not just Bitcoin mining, but now also we're seeing interest from AI and HPC data centers as well?
Oh, I mean, that's a loaded question. ERCOT, like Texas is in general, very business friendly. And I think we see that kind of cascade into a lot of things, including their grid. So there's a lot about ERCOT that's unique. So one of the things is the Texas has gone out of its way to kind of island themselves. And they do this on purpose. It's very much like in their ethos of, we're not a state, we're a nation. And so I think to avoid regulatory oversight from FERC, they basically built, so even when they do have transmission lines going to other markets, they actually make those DC, direct current lines, and instead of AC. And so they're not in sync with the surrounding grids, MISO and SPP. So even though there is like a small amount, call it, roughly like a gigawatt of transmission, so they've gone out of their way to make themselves an island. But that also kind of allows them to make their own decisions and chart their own path, where their main regulatory body that oversees them is the Public Utilities Commission of Texas, and they don't have to kind of check in with the feds or really even listen to anything FERC says. And I think that allows them to change the rules faster, to deploy faster, and to just kind of be the master of their own destiny. So that's like one of the main things that makes ERCOT different. But I would say just the business friendly environment in Texas. You can build faster, you can build transmission a little faster, you can build generation, you can build out load. There's still queues and there's still wait times for all of those things, but it's a lot better in Texas than it is in the rest of the country.
When I was talking to Colin Kelly at Luxor a while back about his setup at his house, I think he mines there. And he was telling me about all the different electricity providers that he could choose from when he was trying to find a power contract. And that was just incredible for me. I'm a native Nashvilleian from Tennessee. And you have Nashville Electric Company, and it's a state-owned entity, and that's it. And That's who you interact with. There's no shopping around. The TVA is the power authority for basically the majority of the state, and everything's kind of downstream of that. So Texas is, ERCOT and the Texas power market has always kind of been an enigma to me, because it's something that I was just kind of blown away at the idea that you could just shop around different utilities, because that's so far beyond what I'm used to. And going back to what you were saying about business friendly, I think that's obviously, like you said, a lot of the reason why miners have migrated there. It also means that power generating assets can get rolled out very quickly. And that's why we've also seen Texas really lead the renewable energy boom in the US. Texas has, I believe, the most solar and wind capacity of any state. But this has also led to a few hiccups, depending on who you ask. So to set the stage a little bit more, because we're going to be talking about how much demand is going to be added to the Texas grid over the coming years with all of this AI and HPC hype. What exactly led to the bottlenecks in 2022 and 2023 that precipitated those price spikes in the summer, where Texans were seeing crazy power cost, a lot of Bitcoin miners curtailed and made a fortune in power credits? Like Riot, I believe in 2023 made something like 75 mil in power credits. What was going on that led to those spikes?
I'd say like that's a pretty loaded question, so I'll try to unpack it in a few different ways. I mean, so just another, you mentioned the renewables, and I did talk about regulatory to start, but you have to also just look at their endowment. They are endowed with some very, very persistently windy rural regions, and they have some of the best solar potential in all of North America. Including the US. So that's a really great combination where you have this, to use a term of someone else in the industry, they're the Saudi Arabia of renewables, but they really are. They have all this wind, they've got all this solar, and they've got this great. They can build it really quickly. So that kind of made them very competitive, and they were some of the first on this new technology, if you want to call solar a new technology. The other thing, to answer your question about like how we got here, another thing that's really unique about Texas, there's a kind of a spectrum of power markets in North America. Without going too deep, like what you mentioned with Tennessee, that's kind of like all of North America used to look like this, the old school utility model. It's kind of a regulatory monopoly by design. You've got one owner of basically the transmission network and all generation assets. That's also who everyone gets power from, and they just get their regulated rate of return. So if it costs them $1 billion to build a power plant, they just amortize that over 20 years, bake that into your power bill, and that's what you pay. And there's no real choice. A lot of markets in North America moved away from that in a process called deregulation. So they kind of, instead of it being a regulated monopoly, they said, hey, anyone can come here and build a power plant and basically sell it merchant and make more of an investment decision. And they kind of destructured the market. So often you do have a utility that owns the wires, but the actual wholesale market of buying and selling energy is deregulated. So you can get people kind of jumping in and out of that. So Texas has definitely gone down the deregulation path, as of most regions in North America. But what makes Texas special is something called an energy-only market. So we see that in Texas and we see that in Alberta. And those are the only two energy-only markets in North America. And what energy-only means is that the price signal to build new generation is built into the energy price itself. And this is a unique. I personally am a big fan of this model. You do get a lot of people who complain about it. And what that creates is it creates long cycles in terms of price. So when the market is hitting 5,000, hitting its price cap, $5,000 a megawatt hour, hour after hour after hour, that's a signal that's screaming, build generation here. But when the market's doing the opposite, when it's $20 an hour for weeks and days on end, that's a signal saying don't build any generation here. And what you'll find is that, the cure for high prices is high prices. The cure for low prices is low prices. So you get these big long cycles what we saw there in ERCOT in 2023 was we're coming off a long period of very low power prices, which would disincentivize building renewables, but incentivize building stuff like Bitcoin mining, like data centers, like air conditioners. So we had a big population boom there as well. So it was kind of coming off a cycle of very low prices. A lot of people built stuff to benefit from that. And then we just saw unseasonably warm temperatures, and then the prices popped. And a lot of people will criticize that, or will say those prices were way too high. Personally, looking at it, I take the long view and go, the market is working as designed. And now you get this build out. You get this build out in batteries. You get this build out in lots of technologies that are responding to that price signal. When you get an event like Winter Storm Uri, or when some people are not on longer term contracts, they're definitely going to complain. They're definitely going to say, whoa, those prices are really high. Something's broken. But from a market design standpoint, it's actually working completely as designed.
So on that note, you mentioned batteries, and this is something that I think most people won't understand or know potentially unless they're really in the weeds here. This is something that you pointed out in the Hash Rate Index 2024 year in review, that the addition of battery capacity in Texas over 2024 helped flatten that curve a little bit, and it balanced the grid in times of stress. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Because they have more coming. I think I have in my notes here, over 2024 and 2025, ERCOT expects 24 gigawatts of solar to be deployed and 13 gigawatts of storage. So how does that interplay change some of those dynamics?
You know, it's probably one of the most fundamental shifts you'll see in ERCOT over the past 5 years. I think the other story here is solar build out. But, when I first started looking at Bitcoin mining meets ERCOT, probably around the 2020 timeframe, I was doing consulting work, and the company that was employing me basically said, why are ancillary service prices so high in ERCOT and not in the rest of North America? So ancillary service prices, you'll hear this term, similar to demand response. It's basically getting paid for your capacity to ramp up a generator, getting paid to be on call versus getting paid to provide the energy. So the difference between having maybe an ambulance driver on call, sitting at home, not actually working, but if there's an emergency, you call on the guy and he's ready to go, versus actually paying him a wage, as an analogy.
So like a nat gas peaker plant would be an example of something like that?
Yeah, a nat gas peaker plant, or a plant that can go to 600 megawatts, but it sits at 400 megawatts, and it can run up that 200 at any point. So this is a separation you get in markets, and every region does it differently. But basically for a lot of regions, so I'll use mine. I live in Calgary, Alberta. We've got a lot of hydro. And so if you've got a bunch of water behind the dam, which is essentially a very, very large battery, you can decide to sell your power and let water flow through the turbine, or you can get paid just for the existence of the water. But if you flow the water through now, you can't do that later when there's higher energy prices. So what a hydro dam operator will do is they'll just sit there and they'll sell their capacity, and so will their competitors. And in a market with a ton of capacity, basically you push, it's a race to zero. You all just want to get paid to own the water. You want to hold the water for higher prices later. So you all just kind of, you just max out the supply, and there's always a bit of a demand. They always need this reserve, but it's basically a race to zero in a market with tons of hydro, and the ancillary prices aren't very high. Whereas ERCOT, they had 500 megawatts of hydro at a time when peak load was about 60 gigawatts. So basically non-existent. So you didn't have this kind of being able to have your cake and eat it too, get paid for the water now, and then actually flow it through the turbine later. So it was do we want to run the generator? Do we want to actually make power with gas? Or do we want to, not run do we want to not run that unit? That's opportunity cost in order to sell the capacity. So you had a lot closer to parity between the capacity price and the energy price. Whereas now you have, on ERCOT's site right now, they're basically saying they have 10 gigawatts of power storage technology, not including hydro, which is still very small. So that's a massive change. That's basically the entire capacity of Alberta built out in a few years in terms of energy storage. And so you've fundamentally changed those ancillary service markets, where now it looks a lot more like a market that has hydro. Whereas before, that was one of the things that also differentiated ERCOT quite a bit, is everything was supply and demand. They really didn't have much capacity in reserve that didn't have a huge opportunity cost of providing that capacity. And as we know, data centers saying, oh, well, us ramping down is the same as gas plant ramping up, that has also increased basically the responsive reserve of ERCOT, and that they're also contributors to something like a race to zero in those markets.
Interesting. So yeah, now would you say that Texas has a surplus with some of these batteries? And an additional point of clarity, they can charge up from anything. It doesn't just need to be solar, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So you could theoretically, sorry for interrupting, but like if nat gas prices are really low at 1 week, might behoove an operator to expend some of that gas, charge the battery, and then sell that power when power prices rise. I mean, that's just one example, but kind of just to your point, you can get much more flexible with how you view dispatching that electricity.
No, that's exactly right. So you don't even know more or less where the electrons are coming from. You just have a battery and you charge based on prices. But yes, it has changed. The one area where I'd hesitate to say there's an oversupply of batteries is because we have got 30 gigawatts of solar. And so in the summer, if we're truly seeing 30 gigawatts at 4 p.m., and then it's going to go to 0 gigawatts by 7 p.m., you've got a 30 gigawatt ramp to manage. And so the batteries right now can currently only handle about a third of that. But I would say that a lot of those batteries got built based on 2023 prices. And I'm sure there's a lot of distressed asset owners saying, well, what do you mean we can't charge it for $30 and discharge for $5,000? And that was a pretty special event. But back to that kind of energy, the price signal, the cure for high prices is high prices. So you see these batteries were, they essentially had ERCOT over a barrel, so they could charge $5,000 in 2023. That absolutely did not happen in 2024. So you already saw the build out just really impact the economics. And if battery economics aren't very good in 2025, then you won't see that build out. And then before you know it, we'll be right back to having a scarcity of that kind of flexible, quick ramp capacity.
Big players in Bitcoin mining demand stability, regulation, and trust. That's why NiceHash has moved its headquarters to Switzerland, a country known for its strong regulatory framework and for keeping its cheese locked in a safe. As one of the most regulated mining platforms in the industry, NiceHash provides institutional miners with a secure, compliant, and transparent solution to manage and maximize their mining output, delivering the reliability and performance expected from the best mining tools, along with firmware, monitoring software, and other essential mining tools. Contact a NiceHash representative today to learn why the top Bitcoin miners are making the switch to NiceHash. You can find out more info in today's show notes. And when you contact them, let them know the Mining Pod sent you.
So maybe these batteries are a good springboard into the really meat of this conversation, specifically how Texas is going to be able to grapple with all of this data center load that it's expecting. So just to rifle off a few stats that will inform our discussion here, ERCOT is expecting peak demand to hit 150 gigawatts by 2030. For reference, in 2024, it was 84 gigawatts. They're expecting 6 gigawatts of data center demand to come online next year. And they have many more in the pipeline, obviously, per that 150 gigawatt peak load projection for 2030. How much will these batteries help solve the problem? Or is this kind of just I don't want to say ersatz solution because clearly there's a use for this, but is this kind of just kicking the can down the road? Or will this actually help with a transition to more load from some of these data centers like AI and HPC?
So if we were just talking Bitcoin, I would say that this is actually going to be very beneficial. High performance compute, it's a different beast. So whereas Bitcoin is very, very price responsive and very performant, so you can ramp down a facility in a matter of seconds. You can confidently say Bitcoin mining does not contribute to peak load, especially if peak load is high prices. But even without that, I think the social contract, most operators are absolutely fine not being there for 20 hours a year, 40 hours a year. High performance compute has a lot of a bigger challenge saying that because they want to. It's more of a base load. It's more 24/7. And the biggest difference is you cannot really pause high performance compute currently. You can't do a hot swap, essentially, in saying, okay, pause this training job in Texas and hand it over to this facility potentially halfway across the world. You can do that with some things. You can do that with inference. So that's when you actually make your chat GPT question. But in terms of training, we're not there yet. The technology isn't there yet. And so they might be contributing to peak load. And then it will become a serious problem. How much of that gets built out? I'm somewhat skeptical just on even just having the transformers and the substations and those supply chains. I think everything available is kind of being gobbled up now. So that 6 gigawatts will likely come in. The 30 gigawatts that they're calling for and the doubling of ERCOT to be determined. I mean, one thing that we're seeing is they want to upgrade the entire transmission system in ERCOT from 345 kV to 700. That's a massive multi-billion-dollar upgrade. And I mean, this happens from time to time in these ISOs, but a lot of that is going to be needed. So we're not just talking about a site, like a farmer's field. We're talking about the entire grid, kind of being needed to upgrade to meet these numbers, and that's a massive undertaking, and that the cost of that gets spread over everybody. So that's so. To what extent it makes sense to socialize AI expenses over the entire population and residential consumers. It's already kind of creating a fight at the Public Utilities Commission of Texas, at ERCOT, saying how do we deal with these challenges? To your question, will they absorb it? I mean, initially, I think it's going to be very beneficial. A lot. What happens is you get out of market signals. So the feds will come in and they'll basically say there's a production tax credit for renewables, for wind. And so because of the endowment in Texas, you get a ton of this stuff built out. And really they're almost just going for the production tax credits. They're somewhat indifferent to the wholesale price of power, the main thing that they produce. And so what we've seen over the past 10, 15 years is massive congestion. So the Panhandle, the northern region of Texas, like that's where Cormant is in the Childress area. That is it's one of the most heavily congested areas in all of the US. Congestion means is that there's so much power trying to get out of that region that it overloads the lines. And then, so it actually makes the prices in that area negative. So you're looking at negative $25 prices, a large percentage of the year, which to a miner sounds amazing. But, why are they negative $25? Well, that's because the production tax credit will pay these wind owners $25. So they're basically not turning off until you punish them to that extent. So one thing we're seeing with the Abilene build out and with some data centers out in Childress is you're actually seeing load kind of respond to this market signal saying, please build something here. There's too much supply. And that's exciting. That's what you want to see markets do. But then once that's, it might actually flip congestion patterns on their head once it all gets built out. But then where does the other 30 gigawatts go? Are we going to locate it all near renewables? And especially if the profile is more baseload, does it really make sense? So that's a big question. And then for mining versus high performance compute, there's another big variable, which is where's the fiber? Where's the internet access? It matters less for a Bitcoin miner, but for high performance compute, that's what they basically just got these maps out and they're looking for this overlap of low energy prices, close to a substation, an existing substation, and close to a fiber highway. And then if they get the right combination of those variables, that becomes a very compelling site to build HPC. The low hanging fruit is going to be gone pretty fast if it's not already.
Yeah, it seems like already getting gobbled up. And if people might be curious as to why we're spending so much time talking about solar and renewables in this, and I just really do want to highlight that has been the majority of capacity build out in Texas over the last few years. I think in part because of those incentives for the credits and things like that, right? But looking at actual baseload that would help maybe furnish this AI and HPC demand, into the future. Currently, I can only find 2 natural gas plants that are currently planned for Texas. And one of them is the Sandow Lakes plant. It's 1.2 gigawatts. The other one is Legend and Lone Star Power Stations, which is about 1.2 gigawatts. that is not projected to gear up until 2028. Now, this is going to be a long introduction to a question, but I'm going to get there, I promise. I really think it's interesting that you mentioned the idea of ERCOT and Alberta being, what did you say, energy first markets?
Energy only.
Energy only markets, because, when the price is really low, that slows the pace of energy generating assets, the build out of them. And then when it's higher, obviously, it incentivizes that, right? Well, right now, like, the prices are lower than we saw in 2023, but investors are starting to get dollar signs based on the AI and HPC boom, or the promise of it, right? And they're starting to see the opportunity for building out baseload in Texas. Case in point, in mid 2024, there were, I think, let me see, I've got my notes right here, 55 gigawatts of nat gas plants proposed, worth almost $40 billion, that the Public Utility Commission of Texas was evaluating. There's just like a flood of applications for nat gas plants in Texas after many years of renewables buildup. All that said, kind of a long-winded way to introduce this, but is this too little too late, in the sense that these plants are going to take a few years to get online? Like, are we kind of just going to be stuck with a complete bottleneck in Texas for some of this AI and HPC demand until some of these nat gas plants come online?
It might be so. I think we need to. I think we should just put a big asterisk on what will actually get built, because so right now, one of the things they're looking at basically making it more expensive to have a project in the queue. I think currently it's relatively low cost, so you can just say, "Hey, ERCOT, I want to build this thing, spend a few $1,000s." And then now they need to study it like it's real. And I think they're trying to increase the cost of having something in the queue so that you at least know that only serious projects are there. Another thing you're definitely going to see is you're going to see bilateral deals. So you're going to see because everyone likes certainty, right? So if you're going to build it, if you're going to spend the exorbitant amount of money, like the millions of dollars a megawatt that these high performance compute data centers cost, you don't really want a big uncertainty around your energy price. And the exact same thing if you're building a gas plant, you don't want this big uncertainty. So those are natural counterparties, where someone looking at building a gas plant, probably including some renewables, and someone looking at building a high performance compute, they're going to sit down in a room and do like a power purchase agreement. They're going to do a PPA, where they kind of, and maybe a 5-year PPA, a 10-year PPA, and they're just going to ignore the wholesale price of power. And they're just going to kind of guarantee each other the revenue streams or the cash flow that they're looking for. So that gas plant wants $50 a megawatt hour around the clock, and the high performance compute facility needs something like that to be economic. They do a PPA, and it's more likely to get done. So we're going to see that, and then that's going to keep some of the cyclical uncertainty from away. But yeah, like we are going to see a bottleneck if compute outbuilds generation, and especially if it's a baseload profile that is not price responsive. So Bitcoin is very price responsive. I actually think it's a wonderful addition to most grids. High performance compute to be determined, but I think they basically run at any price. And I guess the caveat to that is if it's really, really important that they're online 24/7, which it is for a lot of these facilities, they end up building all the backup gen they need anyway. So a 100 megawatt facility has 100 megawatts of backup gen. Well, if you're a sophisticated player, you would view that backup gen as something that can actually trade power markets. So it's there supposed to be for backup, but if you are running on spot and the prices go to the price cap, why not boot up all your own generation, supply your own power, and then essentially your PPA goes back to the market at those higher prices? So we're going to see tons of kind of creative approaches, but even we talked on our last call how even those generator units have their own supply chains getting gobbled up. So I think it's tough to predict like where the bottlenecks will be, but I would guess that compute is going to outbuild generation, and we are going to see some higher prices or some interesting dynamics in the market.
I want to put a pin on what you just said about the generators, because that's kind of one of my next questions is on that, about creative workarounds that these companies could potentially exploit or capitalize on. Going back to ERCOT needing to be a little choosier with who they have to take applications from and kind of overpromises to build out. One thing that really caught my eye recently from a public miner earnings call was Iron talking about this Sweetwater site in Texas. So Iron is building out their Childress site in Texas. They're trying to dedicate 75 megawatts of that to HPC. The rest will go to mining. They're also trying to build out a 2 gigawatt site called Sweetwater in multiple phases. But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who's listening to this, they don't actually have the PPAs in place for it. They're in the application process. Is that maybe a good example of what you're talking about, where in the past we've seen these Bitcoin miners say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z in Texas because there's a really low barrier to entry? That's probably going to go away in the coming years. Is that the general idea? Not necessarily Iron specifically, because I don't know if that's actually the case, but that just struck me as an example of maybe promising something that you might not be able to deliver.
So, you have to look at that in a few pieces. So they study load, and then they study generation, and they look at that differently. And then it gets more complicated if it's behind the meter. So, but yeah, when you say you're going to do over 10 megawatts, you're going to add load, there essentially needs to be a load study. And that study, ERCOT's going to look at that, but then the regional transmission utility company is going to look at that too. And they're going to try to study, okay, how is that going to change the grid? It's challenging because they look at everything in isolation, but then of course you have these massive queues now where it's not really in isolation. You've got tons of generation over here, and then 100 miles away, tons of load. And of course you need to think about how that's going to flow, but they do kind of look at everything in isolation. I think the problem is that the cost of getting in that queue right now, it's very low. So people can kind of just, they can say, they can throw something in the queue, a few $1,000s, and then they can try to go raise money on that. They say, oh, look, that we're in the queue, it's real. And then so they're looking for the financing, which just kind of shows you how speculative that application is. But how does ERCOT know that? How does the utility know this is a speculative application versus one that's very real, definitely going to happen? So I think they're looking at just increasing that cost, whether it's an annual cost or whether that's collateral. So you just get a clearer signal. It actually is really tough. PJM, so that's not an energy only market. They have their own capacity market where they basically, they completely separate out energy and capacity. The getting paid to produce energy versus being around in case they need it are completely separate markets. And so when you don't do energy only, you basically have a committee. You have a room full of experts that decides, or economists who basically decide, okay, there's going to be this much. We need this much capacity. So in PJM, for this year, 2025, 2026, over the period that came before that, 2023, 2024, they basically had in the prior period, they had $2 billion worth of capacity. So that's just kind of a cost that goes on everyone's energy bill. $2 billion for capacity. That's $15 billion. So almost a 1,000% increase for the period afterwards. The only reason that is because of the queue for all this load. So they're looking at all this load. How much of that is real? No one can really, you can't really know, especially with supply chain constraints. But they look at that, they treat it all as real, and then capacity prices essentially 10x. So and then you were talking about thermal. So what we're seeing in PJM is we're seeing plants that were about to retire, a coal plant or a peaker, a gas plant. Now they're not going to retire, or they're much less likely to retire, because even if their economics are horrendous day to day, they used to get paid $29 a megawatt day. Now they're getting paid $270 a megawatt day just to exist. So now they don't, unless they're forced to retire, they're not going to retire. And that's all based on a queue. It's not currently real. There are projects in that queue. Some of them are definitely real, but they've done this. They've now applied this massive cost, which consumers are already going to start paying based on a forecast. And so ERCOT in Texas, we don't have that. Everything's kind of real. So you're looking at the prior price signal and you're responding to it in a lagged fashion. Whereas over here in PJM, you've got this forecast, and now you're already paying people out on the forecast, and maybe that'll work out better for them. It's a leading indicator instead of a lag, but different ways to solve things. But you're going to see this in Texas too. You're going to see units that were scheduled for retirement that are all of a sudden not going to want to retire, and they're going to be thermal units. They're going to be more polluting. But yeah, you're going to see that all over the place, because that's the easiest thing to do. Instead of building new, is just to say, well, why don't we just not retire the things that are already working? Let's retrofit them, let's modernize them, but let's not junk them and then try to replace them.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale? We've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
There are other things that not Bitcoin miners, but data center operators could potentially do you think more creatively or look for alternative energy sources? You mentioned one last week about them seeking out, off-grid gas and then combusting that and putting their own generators on site. I mean, that's Crusoe's made a business line of that. Can you talk about that a little bit? And also if there are any other maybe not unforeseen, but underexplored workarounds that these data centers could look at in terms of getting capacity online?
The off-grid approach makes a lot of sense. And in fact, I can really relate to this. So I was a power trader. I was looking at these negative $25 prices. And as soon as I understood what a Bitcoin miner was, you could pack a megawatt in a CCAN at the time. I had this whole business idea in my head of like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I know where the negative power pricing is. I'm just going to load up CCANs and follow the cheap power around the continent like I'm like a migratory animal. And then what I ended up doing is going off grid and mining on flare gas in Alberta. Not because that's easy, but because it's a hell of a lot easier than all the red tape you have to go through to actually hook up megawatts to a grid. So I completely sympathize and understand why when you have this, when you're competing against the whole world and you want to win the race, why you just can't wait. And so why they're kind of looking at it's a lot faster to just build it ourselves than to integrate with the existing, often kind of legacy grid. But it does require a steady natural gas supply, even going off grid to the extent that the oil and gas guys are doing. Probably not what these data centers are going to do because the gas isn't treated. It's not pipeline grade. So they're probably looking for high volumes, pipeline grade gas, close to a fiber highway. Then it's everything's modular. You have modular generators, 1 to 5 megawatts, 5 to 10 megawatts going into kind of modular racks and modular data centers, and you can deploy in under a year. It's going to make a lot of sense. I think it's ironic with the all the messaging we got over the 10 years of, IKEA is 100% green and Google's 100% green, and the Bitcoin miners are getting so beat up based on this energy math. So then they start signaling that they're 100% green, only to watch their all the Googles and the Metas of the world just completely back off from that. Pretty ironic, but yeah, that's probably the biggest challenge for them is like justifying it based on the narrative that we've seen for the past 10, 15 years there.
Yeah, that is kind of a funny about face there for some of these data center companies. That strategy, though, really only scales so much, right? You could never get one of these Stargate deals, right? That like the Lancium and Caruso campus in Abilene, they're going to host Oracle, and it'll never be able to actually furnish something like that, right?
Well, now you're looking at like a 1 gigawatt generator, which is pretty standard. I'm not saying that that might not pop up, right around like around these areas. But yeah, now you're not. It's not just modular. It's not more off grid or behind the meter. That's just kind of more standard. And yeah, I don't think it scales to that extent. To your question, I think the biggest technological leap is probably on the software side. It's not on the hardware side. So if they can figure out how to do a hot swap with GPUs in the middle of these AI machine learning runs, that would be one of the most disruptive things we see in the industry. They talk about.
I know. Sorry, I want to. Sorry to interrupt, but I think this is really interesting. And I know you're not AI or HPC expert, but can you explain just what the hot swap? I mean, you've kind of explained what it is, but why you can't do it for training a model, but you can for inference, and like what the difficulties are.
And so I'm actually just leaning on people who are a lot smarter than me, telling me that currently we can't do this. I think Luxor's, we're looking at commoditizing compute in general. So I think that goes beyond the SHA-256 algorithm. So we're very interested in commoditizing compute. Does that look like a megawatt hour? Like, are they hour-long blocks? Or are they 5-minute blocks? These are kind of the questions when you're looking at commoditizing compute. But the holy grail of that is that it's truly swappable, that it's truly an interchangeable, fungible commodity. And so the people looking at this problem in Luxor have told me, well, right now, it's mainly training load. It's not inference load, and that's not hot swappable. And I think it's because this, again, my very layman understanding of this, but even the people training these models don't really understand what's going on in the black box. They understand the inputs and the outputs, but what's actually going on, my understanding is you can't even predict the power consumption of a training run. It's not baseload. It's kind of choppy. When the GPUs are grinding, when they're not, when they're passing these weights and parameters to each other. And so it's unpredictable to even the people who are in the weeds, let alone to the people who are a few layers more abstracted to us. If they could do it, though, I think it costs about 10 to 100 times more, depending on the tier of data center. Like a tier 0, the kind of stuff my flare gas company was doing, it's just a box sitting in the dirt that flushes air. Its uptime is atrocious. You're talking about maybe 75% uptime in the summer. But oh well, you're mining Bitcoin, so you're when you're online, you're making money. When you're offline, you're not. Whereas a tier 5 data center, that's like 5 zeros. That's what their downtime is acceptable, is like 5 zeros and then a 1. It's about 100 times more per megawatt to build this stuff. And that's not necessarily going to be HPC. That's like very mission critical stuff, Department of Defense, clients, the 3-letter agency clients. But that's where you've got backups to your backup, and basically there's no such thing as downtime. If you're able to kind of pause a job and then reduce, pause a training run, reduce the uptime of that facility. So basically just ramp it down and then pass off that job to potentially somewhere completely different, completely else in the world. Well, then the cost to build data centers goes down a lot. You don't need $1 million a megawatt or $10 million a megawatt. You're looking, you can get closer to the Bitcoin, maybe not 100, maybe never 100K, but a lot cheaper than $10 million a megawatt, because you don't need the uptime. That's where those price tags come from, is just the redundancies and the redundancies of the redundancies. You can do away with a lot of that. And that would be a technology fix. So maybe not that perfectly analogous to what we saw with DeepSeek, but something similar where someone says, look, I can do everything you're doing, but with less power, or I can do everything that you're doing, but with a lot less uptime. So instead of building one facility for $10 million a megawatt, let's build 3 for $1 million a megawatt, cost savings of $7 million, and just pass the job to wherever the energy is cheaper. That would be a fundamentally disruptive technology. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see it, because the billions of dollars that we're talking about, the reward for solving that problem, is massive. So I think then as a technological optimist, put the chances of someone solving that problem very high.
So technological and process advancement and something akin to Moore's law will save energy markets. but potentially not ramping up capacity. I mean, we're going to need to do both. That all makes sense to me. To kind of close this out, Haley, it really seems like when you look at all of the data and you just run the numbers, there's no way in the short term that markets in Texas or around the US really are going to be able to supply electricity for this coming wave of AI and HPC data centers. Now, there's an argument also to be made that maybe similar to other technology booms like the dot-com boom, we're like getting a little ahead of our skis here and we might not need as much. I think that is an important point, that we actually don't know over the near term or long term either how much of this we're actually going to need to furnish AI demand, because no one's really gauged what that demand will be very well. But just staying in the context of Texas for a second, is the most obvious answer just kind of to have hyperscalers buy out some of these sites? Like maybe they just buy out the Childers site, maybe they buy out the Black Pearl site, and some of these other, I think those are the two big ones, the one from Cypher and the one from Iron. Just make sure I got that correct. Yeah, Black Pearl is Cypher's and Childers is for Iron. Is that the most obvious out, and do you think that's likely?
I think it's highly likely. I think that gets us to so there's about 3 gigawatts of responsive load, 2 gigawatts of very responsive load in ERCOT that is probably Bitcoin mining. So that's your low hanging fruit. That's your Riot facility, BitDeer. So some just really really large facilities. So that's your low hanging fruit. That gets you a lot of the way to that six gigawatts. Then there's the Abilene, what they're building out in Abilene and Childress. But to get to 30 gigawatts, there's just not enough. There's just not enough that's been built. So I kind of agree to you that we're getting over our skis. I mean, one thing I look at was like the DeepSeek news, and there's a lot of, I'm sure you covered that very well. There's a lot of like, was that intentional? Was that a leak? But even if you ignore all of that, $1 trillion of market cap was wiped off in a weekend, from Friday to Monday. 600 billion of that was NVIDIA. To me, that signals not that we're in a bubble, but that there's a ton of uncertainty. If one piece of news release can have that big an impact on, and then for NVIDIA, we're right back 14 days later, that 600 billion drawdown is completely recovered. And so as a Bitcoiner, you kind of know, like, you kind of can dismiss volatility because you're like, well, the price discovery between zero and the reserve currency of the entire world is going to be a little volatile, right? As we right. Figure that out for Bitcoin. So I think for AI, it's the same. It's like you watch what the markets do over a little bit of uncertainty. I think that translates into how solid a business case is there for all these facilities. Is it really all going to get built out? Especially when you start clashing with the social contract. If you're truly raising grandma's utility bill to run some of these facilities, then even if the business case is there, the social license to build them might not be. And so everything has to go very, very smoothly in terms of basically choke points and supply constraints. And if it doesn't, and if you get these market impacts, there goes the social license to build it at all. So I think we can put a big asterisk on, are they really going to build this all out? But to the extent to which these companies will just acquire the energized rack space that it's taking them too long to build, we're already seeing it, and I think we're going to keep seeing it. There's just only so much at this scale.
Yeah, and everyone has their price too, right? I will not be shocked to see a couple of miners sell out some of these big facilities over the next year, because it just, like you were saying, that it makes sense. Well, Haley, that does it, man. Really appreciate you hopping on the horn here. Where can people find out more about what you do, Luxor, and find you on socials if you are on socials?
Yeah, check out Luxor. Check out our hash rate index, and then I'm on the derivatives team, where we are working pretty diligently to commoditize compute. So I'd say that's the main area. My Twitter handle is Statefall. But it's not too commercially geared. I think my main thing is a thread where I was heating some hot water in my home with Bitcoin miners. So that's if you want to check me out on Twitter, but I don't really get into the energy market side there. I'm more just a hobbyist on social.
I mean, people love that stuff too. I've never gotten around to it, and I think my wife like might kill me if I tried to like rig our hot water heater with an S21 or something. But I've always thought that's like the most obvious application for home mining.
I put an insane amount of work into it to learn about immersion, and now what I should get rid of the thread. Although it's the only prominent thing I've ever done on Twitter, because now I would just say use a hydro, use like direct water to chip, like do not mess around with oil. Just the oil is awful to work with. Just use an XP, use a hydro model. You'll be so much better off than following any of the advice that is now dated. But it was a cool project. Like I learned a ton, so no regrets. But but now I'd never do it the same way.
Some lessons learned. Y'all heard it here. Do not do immersion if you're trying to heat that water up for your home. Well, Haley, thanks so much for joining, man. Hope y'all have a good week. Hope y'all keep cracking on there at Luxor. I mean, y'all sponsor the show. I used to work there, so I'm biased, but the derivatives desk especially is like one of the coolest things I think any Bitcoin mining company is doing. So keep cracking on, and yeah, hope we can get you on again sometime soon. This was fun.
Yeah, right on. Well, thanks for having me, Colin.